Her pepper spray blinded the man in the red MAGA cap, and her shouts about the threat drew a crowd in the park. She was convinced that people like him were dangerous, until a police officer revealed who he actually was. A U.S. Army general, simply taking a walk on his day off. What happened next changed their lives and sparked a societal uproar. But let's start from the moment when everything went wrong. It was a scorching Saturday afternoon. Central Park was packed. Parents walked with their children, teenagers sped around on skateboards, and street musicians strummed their guitars. Henry Clark, a sturdy 42-year-old man, strolled along the path in his red MAGA cap. He wore jeans, a t-shirt, and worn-out boots, clothes fit for a casual walk. For Henry, the cap wasn't a political provocation, but a symbol of pride in his country. His appearance drew attention. Some people shot quick sidelong glances. Others whispered among themselves. A few were openly angry, but Henry didn't react. He was used to disapproval and firmly believed his right to express his views should not be subject to attack. Not far from him, Karen Brooks, a 35-year-old woman with a short haircut and a designer bag slung over her shoulder, sat on a bench. She had noticed Henry from a distance. As her eyes fell on his cap, her face twisted with disdain. She leaned toward her companion and muttered, "Typical MAGA people. They think they can go wherever they want and ruin everyone's day." Her companion, a young man sitting beside her, shrugged. "Let it go. He's just walking." But Karen couldn't let it go. She stood abruptly and strode toward Henry. When she got closer, she raised her voice. "Do you even realize that hat is a symbol of hate? People don't want to see that here." Henry, taken aback by her sudden approach, replied calmly, "It's just a hat. I'm walking like everyone else." "Just a hat?" she exclaimed. "Do you know how many people have suffered because of your views?" "Ma'am," Henry replied without raising his voice, "I'm sorry if something bothers you, but that's no reason to be aggressive." This response only infuriated Karen further. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some people started recording the exchange on their phones. "If you don't take it off right now," Karen said, pulling a pepper spray canister out of her bag, "I'll make sure you leave." "Ma'am, that's a threat. Please think carefully about what you're doing," Henry cautioned. But Karen wasn't listening. She raised the canister and sprayed it directly into his face. Henry immediately shut his eyes and stumbled back, trying not to fall. Gasps erupted from the onlookers, and the area buzzed with noise. "Are you serious?" one witness shouted. "That's assault!" Henry, rinsing his face with water someone handed him, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he calmly said, "Can someone call the police?" Karen, instead of retreating, began yelling even louder. "He threatened me! He was provoking all of us with his hateful symbols!" The crowd started to split. Some defended Henry, while others sided with Karen. Phones continued to record every second. A patrol car soon arrived on the scene. A young officer with a cautious expression stepped out and approached Henry and Karen to assess the situation. The story was just beginning. Sergeant Michael Brown surveyed the scene carefully. Henry stood by a fountain, rinsing his eyes, while his cap lay on the ground. The crowd buzzed with chatter. Karen, her head held high, gestured wildly as she addressed the officer. "Officer," she said loudly, "this man threatened me with his aggressive symbolism. He was provoking everyone. I was protecting myself and others." The sergeant gave her a puzzled look. "Ma'am, are you saying this man attacked you?" "Yes. Well, not physically, but he threatened us with that hat. Do you understand it's a symbol of hate?" Michael turned to Henry, who calmly approached, dabbing his face with a handkerchief. His eyes were still red and watery, but he maintained his composure. "Sir, would you like to file a complaint?" the sergeant asked. "Yes," Henry replied calmly. "She attacked me without cause. There are witnesses." "Witnesses?" Karen cut in sharply. "Everyone here saw how you provoked us with your disgusting hat." "It was just a walk, ma'am," Henry replied softly but firmly. "I didn't bother anyone." At that moment, a man in the crowd stepped forward, holding up his phone. "Officer, I have everything on video. Here, take a look. The sergeant took the phone and watched the footage. It clearly showed Karen confronting Henry, escalating the situation, and then spraying him. "This isn't how you describe the situation, ma'am," the officer said, handing the phone back to its owner. Karen flushed, but refused to back down. "Whose side are you on? The side of these haters?" "Ma'am," Michael interrupted, "I'm here to sort out what happened. Right now, it looks like you attacked this man without any valid reason." Karen raised her voice, hoping to gain sympathy from the crowd. "I was protecting the public. People like him are dangerous. Do you know how much harm they've caused?" The officer remained unfazed. "We're only addressing this incident, ma'am. Did you know that using pepper spray without justification is classified as assault?" Karen faltered, but quickly tried to recover. "It was self-defense." "Against what?" Henry asked with a faint smirk. "A hat?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. The murmurs of conversation grew louder. Sergeant Brown sighed and turned back to Henry. "Sir, do you have identification?" Henry reached into his pocket and handed over his ID. The sergeant studied it carefully, his expression shifting as he read the name. He glanced back at Henry, his demeanor noticeably changing. "One moment," Michael said, walking back to his patrol car to run a check. Karen, still fuming, shouted after him. "Why are you wasting time? Arrest him! It's obvious!" When the sergeant returned, he looked directly at Karen. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand what you've done." "You don't understand," she shot back. Michael turned to Henry, addressing him with newfound respect. "General Clark, I apologize that you've been subjected to this. We'll file a report and take it from here." The crowd fell silent. Karen went pale. "Wait, General?" she stammered, taking a step back. Henry nodded. "Retired. I'm just here for a peaceful day off, ma'am. Not to wage war with anyone." Karen's face drained of color as the reality of the situation hit her. She glanced around, but the supportive looks were gone. She stammered. I didn't know." "Ignorance isn't an excuse, ma'am," Henry replied calmly. "Maybe next time, think before you act." The sergeant turned to Karen. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us to the station to provide a statement." As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring about what had just unfolded, Henry picked up his cap, dusted it off, and put it back on. Without a glance at Karen, he headed toward an ice cream truck, ignoring the lingering stares. Karen finally realized the gravity of what she had done, and the serious consequences that awaited her. The atmosphere at the precinct was tense. Karen sat on a wooden chair in a small interrogation room, her once confident expression now replaced with panic. Sergeant Brown moved in and out, completing paperwork and discussing the case with his colleagues. Henry, meanwhile, sat in the reception area, calmly sipping coffee from a vending machine. He was no stranger to situations like this, though they always left a bitter taste. A few officers in the precinct seemed to recognize him. One greeted him warmly, while another nodded respectfully. After about half an hour, Sergeant Brown returned to the room where Karen sat. He placed Henry's complaint and her written statement on the table in front of her. "Ma'am," he began, taking a seat across from her, "I need to clarify a few things." "Of course," Karen replied quickly, hoping her words might help mitigate the situation. "You've stated that this was self-defense," the sergeant continued, "but the video clearly shows the man simply walking through the park, not engaging in any aggressive behavior. How do you explain that?" Karen shifted uneasily in her chair. "I felt threatened. That's not always something you can see on video. Sometimes you just know someone is dangerous." "Dangerous?" Michael asked skeptically. "How exactly?" "His hat," she blurted out. "It's a symbol of hate. I thought he might be some kind of radical, or worse." The sergeant studied her carefully. His tone remained calm but firm. "Ma'am, symbolism isn't justification for assault. If you felt threatened, you could have called the police. Instead, you chose a different path." Karen tried to defend herself. "But look at what's happening in this country. People with those views, That doesn't excuse your actions, Michael interrupted. Moreover, you attacked someone without knowing who he was. Karen froze. The word general still echoed in her mind, as it had been spoken in the park. She couldn't believe the scale of the consequences her actions had brought upon her. Meanwhile, in the hallway, an older officer approached Henry. General Clark, we'd like to apologize again for what happened. This will be resolved in your favor. Thank you, officer, Henry replied. But I'm not interested in revenge. What matters to me is understanding. I don't want situations like this to keep happening. The officer nodded. We'll ensure the case is handled properly and use it as a teaching moment. But what should we do about the suspect? Henry paused to think. He was a man of principle, not malice. After a moment he said, Let the court decide. I'm not out to ruin someone's life, but justice needs to be served. Soon after, Sergeant Brown returned to Henry. Sir, we're ready to finalize your statement. Would you like to speak to the suspect directly? At first, Henry thought about declining, but then nodded. Yes, I think it might help. The sergeant brought Karen to the common area. Her face was pale, her expression frightened. When she saw Henry, she looked down at the floor. Ma'am, Henry began calmly, I have something to say to you. We live in a free country. People can have different views, and that's okay. But you had no right to attack me, or anyone else, because of your assumptions. I didn't know you were, Karen started to say, but Henry raised his hand to stop her. It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that your actions were wrong, and actions have consequences. I hope you learn from this. Karen, realizing she had no defense left, muttered softly, I'm sorry. I really didn't think. After their conversation, the case was sent to court. Meanwhile, the video from the park had gone viral on social media. People were divided between sympathizing with Henry and condemning Karen. Discussions erupted online about how stereotypes and biases were tearing society apart. The story was reaching a turning point. The day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens had gathered to witness the resolution of this high-profile case. The videos from the park had made the incident a national story. Karen's defense argued that her actions were driven by a perceived threat, while the prosecution presented evidence of an unprovoked attack. Henry entered the courtroom with a confident stride. He wore a sharp navy blue suit, underscoring his stature and seriousness. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Karen, who appeared nervous and avoided making eye contact with the crowd or cameras. The trial began with the court playing the video of the incident. The footage clearly showed Karen escalating the situation and using pepper spray without provocation. The courtroom murmured in disapproval as the video ended. The judge raised a hand to restore order. The defense opened by arguing, My client did not act out of malice. She felt a genuine threat and acted out of fear for her safety. Henry listened silently, his expression unreadable. When it was his turn to speak, he addressed the court in a measured tone. I understand that fear can drive people to act, but fear is not an excuse for aggression. If we let personal biases dictate our actions, what kind of society will we become? His words drew nods of agreement from many in the courtroom. During cross-examination, the prosecution asked Henry, Mr. Clark, can you describe what happened after the incident? Henry recounted his actions calmly, calling the police, waiting, and cooperating with officers. He avoided dramatic language, relying instead on factual, composed statements. His poise left a strong impression on everyone present. When it was Karen's turn to testify, she spoke in a trembling voice. I made a mistake. I didn't think. This incident has taught me a lot. Her apology, however, felt unconvincing to many. After reviewing all the evidence, the judge delivered the verdict. The court finds Ms. Brooks guilty of assault. She is ordered to pay a fine, attend mandatory anger management courses, and issue a public apology to the victim. Karen went pale, but didn't contest the ruling. Later that day, outside the courthouse, Henry gave a brief interview. Reporters swarmed him with questions about his thoughts on the case. "I'm not angry at Ms. Brooks," he said, "but I hope this case serves as a lesson, not just for her, but for all of us. Different views don't make us enemies. We need to learn to respect one another." Karen's public apology came a week later. Standing before a camera, she read from a prepared statement. "I sincerely apologize to Mr. Clark and to anyone else affected by my actions. I've learned how important it is to think before acting." The speech sparked a wave of online debate. Many doubted her sincerity, but some commended her for taking responsibility. The final scene unfolded back in the same park. This time, Henry was walking with his family. His MAGA cap was still on, but the reactions around him were different. Some people approached to shake his hand, while others nodded respectfully from a distance. Henry paused by the same fountain and looked at his reflection. A faint smile crossed his face. He had done more than defend his rights. He had shown that patience and dignity could overcome prejudice. Turning to his daughter, who was skipping beside him, he said, "Always stay true to your principles, but remember, fight with wisdom, not with hate."